Hello, American government. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have another look into one of the other branches of the federal government. Today we are going to spin off into the executive branch. And one thing to talk about the executive branch is kind of the role. There's more to the executive branch than the president, but that is going to be our primary focus today. When we're talking about the executive branch, one thing that's usually used to describe the presidency is often a glorious burden, which are usually two words that mean the opposite thing. Glorious meaning great, supreme, large, amazing, and then burden usually being something very negative, something very heavy weighing on you. But there is a lot that comes with this. With great power comes great responsibility, and there are a lot of different impacts it has on the individual. So picking the leader is so very, very important for our democracy. A great example of this is you can look at how physically people change over time. This is Obama in 2009 and 2017, and how it really has an impact on the physical aspect of it. You can see the graying of the hair, you can see all the lines on the face starting to form, and Obama is the youngest president that was ever elected. So imagine what happens when you have people that are more the average age of presidents, which are much older, a decade or two older. And so let's look at some of our other past presidents, right? We have President Bush when he was elected in 2001, right? Or he was in 2000 and took office in 2001. And then big thing that happened at the end of 2001 is 9/11. So there's a lot of things that happened there. Hurricane Katrina. So George W. Bush has a lot of physical features. You can see again all the wrinkles and the graying of the hair and a lot of physical changes it weighs on people. Or before that, Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001. That's a sharp, sharp increase. But these are examples of these changes, the physical toll that stress has on the human body. We can go even way, way further back. We're going to take a look at one of America's most famous presidents, Abraham Lincoln. Elected in 1860, he doesn't even serve 8 years, but he served until 1865. And the one major thing that Lincoln deals with is the US Civil War. So look how great of an impact this has physically on this man in just 5 years. They don't even really look that similar. You see how much of a change this really creates and has on Abraham Lincoln, right? So there's a lot of stress and a weight that goes on to this person. You got to think about what they can do, right? Obviously, they have the single most influential individual, even though we have setups that break up the way that our government works to check the power of the other branches, this is the single most important individual. So there must be some very, very large things that we have to throw on their shoulders that they have to deal with. So that's why picking our president is so very, very important. When we're looking at the executive branch, we're really going to talk about it in four different ways. There's four things that hopefully that when you leave this video, you should understand. Number one, who makes up the executive branch? So when we use this term, who are we talking about? Just like when we talk about the legislative branch, it's Congress, but there are two different houses. There's a lot of different aspects to it. Two, what are the qualifications for being president? Because it's the most important part of the executive branch. Three, what happens when a president can't serve? And four, what powers does the president actually have? So we'll look at each one of these and I'll remind you of them when we get to them and try to review these as we go. So first off, goal number one, who makes up the executive branch? Basic question that we should be able to understand. So the executive branch has some subdivisions. There is the president, there is the vice president, and then there is the cabinet. And they all have they each have unique roles. Most of them are all formed to help the president accomplish the goal. So at the very head of the executive branch, and the largest, most famous one is the president. When George Washington was first elected president, we didn't really have all the rules sort of laid out. We didn't have a concrete system in place. But one thing that people really realized is that one man can't really solve everything, even as small as the country was compared to the size our country is now, that they need people to help them carry out their duties. Either it just be advice, people that need assistance to carry out these actions or to watch over specific sectors of our country. And that's where the cabinet is first created. There are other people that help the president do his job. The first one is the vice president, and his role is very vague, but we'll talk about the president, vice president's explicit roles. There are cabinet members that help him accomplish this task, and the cabinet members continuously change from presidency to presidency. They can change inside the presidency, and the number of cabinet positions also can expand over periods of history. We have all these different independent and executive agencies that help fill in these roles. Um, but what happens with these areas is the powers of each one of these kind of advisors or these groups that help the president, the vice president, cabinet members, and all of these other independent agencies or executive agencies, none of them are really defined in the Constitution, which makes it very, very um, fluid and vague about how they're going to actually take on this role. So depending on the person that fills these roles depends on how great or how small this role is going to be filled, or also depending on the president. The only one that really has anything sort of laid out for them in the Constitution is the vice president, who only really has one major power that's listed. They preside over the Senate, but they don't have a vote at all, and they can't speak. They just are there to sort of help run things as needed. Only time they actually get a vote is if there's a tie and they are the tie-breaking vote. But other than that, they don't have any other explicit express powers. Only the president does. After that, these people, it's kind of made up as the time permits it or as the president permits it. So that is who we're working with. It's the president and all the other people that support him, including the vice president, the cabinet, and other independent agencies. Our second thing is what qualifications do you have to meet to become president? So what are our minimum qualifications? So the only qualifications that we have listed to be president of the United States is going to be found in the Constitution, which is where we should look to find all of our information about government. If we want to know the truth, go right to the source. We're going to find that in Article 2, Section 1. So Article 2 really covering the executive branch. Article 1 covered the legislative, and Article 3 would cover then the judicial branch. But Article 2 is going to cover the executive branch. Section 1, so the very first section we're going to see, covers presidential qualifications and any restrictions we really have. What that means is you have to be at least 35 years old. You have to be a natural born U.S. citizen, so born in the United States or born to U.S. parents. Maybe you're visiting outside of that. That's happened in the past. That was brought up with Senator Ted Cruz. That was a question if you could even run for president in 2016. And then ultimately, you have to be a 14-year resident of the United States of America. So you can't just be 35 years old, you were born in the United States, and you leave and you go to Guatemala. And then at the age of 35 or 36, you come back and say, I'm going to run for president. You have to actually live in this country for at least 14 years. So there are some very basic qualifications, but other than that, there are no education restrictions. There are no history of serving in government restrictions. So there's no really limits there. You just have to meet those three qualifications. Now, when we're talking about meeting those qualifications, it's not just one or two of them. You have to meet every single one of them. So if you do not meet one of them, you are not eligible to run for president. So, for example, if you are not 35 years old, you can't run for president regardless of any of the other factors. If you are not a natural born US citizen, right? So, say you're over 35 years old, you've been in the United States for 14 years, but you were born as a citizen of, I don't know, Canada, and then you come to the United States, you can't run to be the president. You have not met those qualifications. The other thing that we really have here is the vice president, and the vice president is a very fluid role, so the restrictions are not really that explicitly stated. You see different relationships with vice presidents. For example, this picture, you have Barack Obama, who was the youngest president ever elected. And because of that, he picked an older vice president who was meant to balance him out. And there's a lot of great memes with Joe and Obama, but they have a really interesting relationship. Some are much closer, some are more business relationships, some are there just to balance their. But that is kind of the makeup of those qualifications. The vice president doesn't have those qualifications, so it really kind of could be anybody. But you're going to pick somebody that your party supports and that the nation would support because they're getting both of you. So you're not just going to pick your 5-year-old child, although there isn't really maybe a restriction to that. It could be anybody. That's what you have to meet for the presidency. For the vice presidency, it's much more fluid, and it's kind of depends who fills that role to take it up. When we're talking about kind of secession, that's the next piece. So what happens if you have a president that can't serve? And that's a very broad term what that means. That could be death, that could be resignation, that could be sickness, mental illness. There are this whole other system of what happens when our president is not fit to serve. When you are elected, after the year 1800, they changed the rules for elections. The president and the vice president are selected together, and you're elected for 4-year terms. Until the 1950s, you did not have to stop after just 2 terms. So after 8 years, you did not have to stop. You could keep going almost indefinitely. However, this only happened one time where someone served longer than George Washington. George Washington originally served 2 terms, and then he stepped away from office because he was done. He didn't want to do it anymore, and he really thought it was important that the country be able to move on and pass over power to different leaders as time goes on. But that whole process wasn't really enacted, and that secession process wasn't really used until the 1840s. But after someone actually served more than 2 terms, there were people that had tried, but the only person that served more than 8 years as president is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was elected in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944, but there were no limits there. The reason people elected him so many times, dealing with the Great Depression, we started experiencing immense amount of success, and then also World War II broke out, and so people really wanted a lot of consistency, but then he eventually died in office. After he actually died, 6 years after World War II ends, his vice president, who then took over, actually helped push this amendment through that restricted people to serve as president. So you could either serve 2 terms, you could be elected for 2 terms, or no more than 10 years. So, for example, say I served as vice president to President Smith. President Smith dies within the first week of office, right? That would be 3 years. If I run again, I could win that election. I would have served 7 years. I would not be eligible to run a second time because that would put me over that 10-year limit. But say I am like President Lyndon Johnson, who takes in office after his president Kennedy was assassinated, only 1 year left in that term. So Kennedy had served 3 years. That's 1 year. Johnson ran one time in 1964 and he won. That would only be 5. He could have ran in 1968, but he chose not to. So these are the systems that we put a restraint, we put a cap limit. So usually presidents are elected once and then re-elected for that second term, and they know that there's not going to be another term. So they push a lot of their legislation, and they're a lot more a lot less restrictive, that is, in the type of things that they're going to push and fight for. But when we're talking about this word secession, we really need to understand what it means to succeed someone. Now, you could be successful. We're not talking about the quality of what you're doing, but you come after someone. Maybe you think about the term from the Civil War of secession, of breaking away. It's a different term, right? Succeed. If you succeed someone, you come after them. So when we have a president that dies, right, we know that the next person to take over in office is the vice president. Is there a difference if the president quits? Does that same vice president get to move up that slot, or does that vice president have to go with the president who quits? Doesn't matter. If they are removed from office, so say that in the most recent impeachment, President Trump, if President Trump was actually convicted by the Senate, found guilty and removed from office, does the vice president just slide up and take that presidential role? In all of these cases, the answer is yes. It doesn't make a difference how it happens, whether it's assassination or illness, resignation or removal. If the president is deemed unfit to serve, then the vice president then takes that spot. If both the president and the vice president are unable to serve, there is a long list of all of these people who would then take over that role. This all comes from a piece of legislation that was enacted later into U.S. history. It's called the Presidential Succession Act, that lays out how the order would go if the president is unfit to serve. So if the president is unfit to serve, then the vice president would take over. If also the president and the vice president go down, say in a plane crash together, then the Speaker of the House, who is a majority leader, it's an elected position in the House, from the majority party. So in this case, the Democrats, the Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. She would take over. Then, if the Speaker of the House, Vice President in the U.S., and the U.S. President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House are all on a plane that goes down, then the President pro tempore would take over. The current President pro tempore is Charles Grassley. He's a Republican because they come from the majority party. But we'll keep working on that what if scenario. If the President, the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and the President pro tempore are all on a plane and it goes down, then the cabinet secretaries would go in order of their department. There is really a list over 20 people long that goes all the way through it. Now, then there's always that one kid or that one question: what happens if all of these people go down? Well, if all these people go down at the same time, we're pretty much screwed. We would probably have bigger issues in our hands about why are all these people in the same spot all. If you want to look a list at all of the people, the order in which they would take over, it's listed like this: the Secretary of State, then Treasury, Defense, General, Secretary of the Interior, all of these positions. Now, why are they in this order? This was the order in which they were created. So the first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. The first Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, and so on and so forth, all the way down. The most recent one and the very last one on this list is the Secretary of Homeland Security that was created by President George W. Bush after 9/11. So there is a system and a flow of this entire process from top to bottom. So we've used presidential secession many times when the president is unfit to serve, but we've never had to go beyond the vice president, although we do have a plan to go that far if the case does arise. Our first time this ever happens is William Henry Harrison. He dies of natural causes. He goes out and gives this huge, big, passionate speech, and he refused to wear a coat after he wins this election, and he catches pneumonia and dies within 2 months. And so his vice president, John Tyler, takes over. Then President Zachary Taylor also dies of natural causes, not too far into the future. So we're now into around the 1850s. The next president, the third president to ever be removed from office before his time is up. He does not die of natural causes. He's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and President Andrew Johnson takes. Then at the end of the 1800s, we have James A. Garfield is assassinated, and Chester Arthur takes over. Then at the very beginning of the 1900s, in 1901, William McKinley is assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt takes over. After that, Warren Harding, who's elected in 1920, he dies in 1923 of natural causes. So Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, takes over. So we've seen this. Franklin Roosevelt dies, right? FDR dies after being elected for the fourth time. And then after his presidency, the 22nd Amendment will be passed in 1951 that will put a limit. But until him, there was no limit. Then JFK, the only other more recent person to be removed from office due to death. He was assassinated in 1963, and Lyndon Baines Johnson takes over. And then Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is the only president in U.S. history to ever resign from the Oval Office. He actually quit. People didn't even know that was possible. And so his vice president, Gerald Ford, takes over. And he is very, very unique. And we're going to talk about that for just one quick second. So the 25th Amendment was passed in the 1960s. So JFK was assassinated in 1963. And 1967, the 25th Amendment was added that if the president can't complete his term, the vice president becomes president. And that's not new. What became interesting is that if the vice president office is ever vacant, so whether that's the president is killed and the vice president slides up, or the vice president quits for some reason, then the president gets to appoint that new vice president with Senate approval. What happens here in this story is Nixon is elected 2 times, in 1968 and 1972. But his first vice president, a man by the name of Spiro Agnew, has to resign because of tax evasion issues in 1973. But what most people will know about Nixon is the Watergate scandal. So he has his vice president who was elected with him in 1972, just like in 1968. In 1973, Spiro Agnew has to resign because of tax evasion, because of a lot of investigations with the Watergate scandal. So Agnew's out, and Nixon appoints Gerald Ford as his vice president, never elected. Then Nixon has to resign because of the Watergate scandal. So Nixon is out. Ford slides up to president, a person who's never been elected by the people. And to make things interesting is because now he is president, his vice presidency spot is vacant. So he picks a vice president, Nelson Rockefeller. And these two men were never elected. It's the only president and vice president group that has never been elected. So this is just an example about how these laws can work. It may not seem necessarily the most ideal because these two men served for 2 years and neither of them were elected by the American public, and they're not going to be very popular. But one thing you will really see is you will see this kind of orderly flow to a lot of this proceeding in the executive branch, and that's the way it's supposed to be. It shouldn't be kind of a passionate decision making type of deal. This should be a rule and order and law in a time of chaos or in a time of disunion or a time of a little bit of disruption, so that this can hopefully smooth a lot of these things out. The only other way to have this kind of secession start to begin is through the impeachment process. Now, we've had people die of natural causes, we've had multiple presidents assassinated, we've even had one president quit, but we've never had a president impeached and then convicted. So impeachment really came to light where a lot of people don't really know it in modern day because we haven't really seen it. There's only 3 times it's ever happened in U.S. history. Number one. Number two, a lot of people had a lot of misunderstandings or confusions, especially in the impeachment of Trump. So what happens in impeachment is that an individual is charged with a crime, right? Just because you're charged with a crime doesn't mean you're found guilty. You're then taken to trial. So you're charged with misconduct, any high crime or misdemeanor or high misdemeanor or crime that the president can be impeached of. The House of Representatives gets to decide should we bring forward these charges. In this case, the democratically controlled House of Representatives did and sent it to the Senate, who then began to vote. This does not mean that anyone is removed from office, and that's super important because we've had 3 presidents that have been impeached. None of them have been removed. President Johnson, after President Lincoln is assassinated, President Bill Clinton, and President Donald Trump have all been impeached, but none of them were removed from office. It's really this idea that all citizens should hopefully be treated the same. You're innocent until proven guilty. You have to be taken to trial, right, and given that chance. And then after that, things can start to proceed as normal. If you have enough evidence and if they find that you're guilty of these crimes, the Senate will then vote, and that vote will count. You need a 2/3 majority. You need an overwhelming majority because this is a very, very big decision. All right, let's look at some fun facts regarding the president. So things to really consider when we're talking about the scope of American history all the way back to George Washington. Number one, the president and vice president can be removed from office. Either of them or both of them, you can remove any federal official from office, including Supreme Court judges, including people from the legislative branch, for right. This is what's used in the Constitution, and again, it's very vague to allow it to be interpreted for many different decades, different times. High crimes and misdemeanors, so anything that's deemed significant. So they can do something wrong, say they commit all right, something they take an action that's not really the most ideal, but if it doesn't fit the terms of high crimes and misdemeanors, that is subject to interpretation for the time period. And we really saw that argument come up in the Trump impeachment case for sure. No presidents have ever actually been convicted and removed. We've had, again, 3 different presidents that have, right? And hopefully, right, you can remember from when I said them not that long ago, but we have the Johnson administration. He is impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act, which said that a president could not fire any cabinet position member without Senate or congressional approval. And he does it anyway. The reason why there's such a big issue, the Republicans hold control of Congress, and Johnson is a Southern Democrat in charge of rebuilding the country after the Civil War. So there's a lot of tension there. He does it anyway. He's taken to trial, but he's found not guilty by one single vote. Then you have President Bill Clinton. President Bill Clinton was taken to trial not for his sexual misconduct necessarily. That is what a lot of people remember, but lying under oath perjury. was his big issue, and he was sent to this. He was it had impeachment charges brought up against him, sent to the Senate. He was also found not guilty, and the most recent one was President Trump. He was impeached on two different charges. Both of them failed. But the one unique thing about the Trump impeachment was that there was one Republican that voted on one of the charges to actually impeach and remove, not impeach this individual, but remove this individual from office. So that was a huge change. First time that's ever happened. Our last thing we're going to look at very quickly is what can the president actually do? The president has a lot of different roles, and sometimes we may say that the president wears many hats, and we'll see really the scope of presidential power. Once again, when we are looking for what powers does the president actually have, the first thing we have to go to is go to the Constitution. If you go to Article 2, Section 2, and Section 3, you're going to find these powers, these roles listed. He has kind of 7 hats he has to wear, or 7 different jobs the president has to take charge of. The first one is called the Chief of State. He has to represent the United States at public events, and he has to be really the face of the nation. So he is the chief of the state, the United States of the country as a whole. Right? An example of this is after 9/11, the president of the United States was George W. Bush. He went out and he delivered the first pitch at Yankee Stadium following the attacks in Manhattan. So kind of this symbol, a ceremonial symbol at some point is he is the face of the entire nation. This one person is supposed to represent the entire country. Role number 2, the chief diplomat. They have to really be involved with interacting with leaders from all different types of countries. Now, the president obviously does not have the power to create treaties or declare war, but they are the people that sometimes are discussing these decisions, producing some document that is then sent and introduced to Congress to pass. But they are the people that are meeting with these major leaders from these other countries. Even though their countries may not be set up just like ours, it's a way of kind of reaching the top level officials at either end. So today, whether it's President Trump going to meet Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, or any leader for that matter, that's just one small example. They're trying to create some lasting relationship or some foreign policy that'll hopefully be beneficial for both sides, then bring back some ideas, proposals that'll then be introduced into Congress. One example of this is the Jimmy Carter presidency. Jimmy Carter is the president after Nixon resigns, Ford takes over, and Ford finishes out Nixon's second term. Jimmy Carter is president from 1976 to 1980. He meets with the president of Iran to try to broker some sort of peace agreements or some peace and stability in the Middle East because there's a lot of violence really breaking out in that area. So he tries to bring that down a level, but he meets with these presidents to try to create a better foreign policy. The third power is the chief executive officer, or just the chief executive. The president is controlling all of these different agencies that he kind of has the responsibility to really make sure that they carry out the laws that are made by Congress. He is the head of the executive branch, so anything that happens, right, the executive branch is in charge of actually enforcing and making sure those laws are actually implemented. Great example of this is, say, like Dwight Eisenhower getting involved in the 1950s with forcing Southern schools to actually desegregate and integrate. You can also look at it in the 1960s as LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act, again, pushing forward legislation that he is the person that is requiring these federal officials to actually enforce this, or these state officials to actually enforce these rules and regulations that are being rolled out, even if they don't necessarily agree with them. The next big one is the chief legislator. So the president himself does not have the power to pass bills, but he can send messages to Congress. He can encourage them to draft legislation. He can introduce bills to Congress and have them vote on it. And he can do this in a variety of different ways, calling through speeches, meetings with different senators or representatives, really trying to put legislation on the floor. And we can see this as presidents hold massive meetings, or even like the State of the Union addresses as well. Sometimes presidents will push for different pieces of legislation, or just meeting in front of them. Johnson did this very often when trying to push through civil rights legislation in the 1960s. He is also the commander in chief. So the president is, as the Constitution says, the commander in chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. All military leaders have to report to him. They take orders from the president. He is the top line level defense. So if we were to use nuclear warheads, that would have to come from the office of the presidency to make that call. The military leaders have to defer to him. So he is really the top chain of command. Example of this is right after 9/11, George W. Bush helped lead some military exercises, went to visit and meet with these military leaders on some of these bases, for example. They also have things that are not necessarily the national spot, but they also have some more specific roles, like being the chief of their party. The president has to sort of be the face of their party for that time period, and so a lot of people will usually defer to what that president pushes forward. Not always, but a great example would be kind of the role that Barack Obama has in the Democratic Party right now. And people are really itching to hear what he has to say, who he's going to nominate, either it be Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, even though it would make sense that Biden being his vice president, he would most likely endorse him. But they really want that sort of endorsement from him. They look to him as a source of information, a source of support for sure. You can see this time and time again. A great example. This is just one photo that I pulled from Life magazine, but Ronald Reagan served 2 terms, 1980, 1984, and when the 1988 elections came around, he supported and openly nominated his vice president, George H.W. Bush, when he ran for president. So these are just examples of past presidents providing support or backing up certain nominees. The last major one that we'll look at is the role as the chief citizen. He's supposed to be the moral leader of the United States, this kind of role model, the general interest of the public. And so there's various ways that presidents do this. Usually after natural disasters, you'll see presidents go to certain areas to try to console and meet with different. This is one from the Obama administration. So there were a bunch of tornadoes that destroyed towns in Missouri back in the Obama administration, or maybe President Bush going down to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina that killed so many people, and trying to console and meet with these people and be down there on the front lines for at least a short while. All of these examples are things that we should hopefully be able to understand at the end of today, such as one, who makes up the executive branch. It's mainly the president who is the head. The other parts are there to support him, such as the vice presidency, the cabinet, and other executive agencies. To be president, you must be at least 35 years old. You must be a natural born U.S. citizen, and you must have lived in the United States for 14 years. If the president can no longer serve, what happens? That's question number 3. We have to understand that there's a presidential succession. It will usually be the vice president, but if both of them cannot serve, it will go to the Speaker of the House. If all 3 of them can no longer serve, the President pro tempore. And after that, there's a succession list going through all of the different parts of the cabinet in order in which they were created. So there's a system and a plan that goes into place. And lastly, what powers do they have? There are 7 different roles that the president has to fill, that they have to take charge of. There's 7 roles or 7 hats that this president, our presidents wear. Number 1 is the chief of state. They're kind of the ceremonial head of the federal government. 2, they're the chief executive. They are the head of the executive branch, so a lot of things kind of run through them to enforce that. There is the chief legislator as well. They really propose a lot of new legislation or any different initiatives that they really want to push. They can do that through speeches, meetings, or introducing bills. We have the commander in chief, so he's kind of the head of the Army's national forces. He makes these final calls. He's the chief diplomat. He really is sort of this architect of American foreign policy, that he really meets with all these different leaders to ensure that we can be on peace negotiation terms and maybe introduce legislation, then using that other role to Congress, hopefully create some peace negotiations. He is the chief of his party, so he's the representative of his own political party, or she, in the future. And lastly, the chief citizen, representative of all people in the United States of America. So there are all these different ways that we can look at the executive branch, and the president is obviously the most well-known one. There's a lot of great resources for you to take a look at. If you go to Crash Course, they have an entire thing about Crash Course Government or Crash Course Civics that you can look specifically on each one of these branches. There's a really good one on presidential powers for you to check out if you need a little bit more information. If you have any other questions, just leave a link or a comment down in the section down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.